Have you ever pictured a medieval knight, shining armor, sword in hand, always ready for battle, and wondered if they actually slept in all that steel? Sounds insane, right? But the truth behind this legendary image is way more surprising than you think. Today, we're diving deep into the real reason why some knights did sleep in their armor, and why most actually tried not to. Forget what you've seen in games or movies. This is raw, uncomfortable, gritty medieval reality. Number 1. Myth versus reality. The classic image of a medieval knight sleeping soundly in full plate armor, as if ready to jump up and fight at any moment, has less to do with historical fact and more to do with how later generations wanted the past to look. This whole idea really took off in the 19th century, especially during the Victorian era, when writers, artists, and historians began to romanticize the Middle Ages. They saw knights not just as warriors, but as symbols of honor, bravery, and chivalry. In paintings and literature, knights were shown as flawless heroes who were always armored, always dignified, and always ready to defend virtue, even in their sleep. These stylized portrayals helped shape the myth, and eventually that myth got passed down into modern pop culture through films, television, and especially video games, where practicality often takes a back seat to dramatic flair. But when you look closer at what we know from actual medieval records, you find that the reality was far more practical, even mundane. Medieval chroniclers didn't glorify constant armor wearing. In fact, they often described sleeping in harness, which meant staying in armor overnight, as something knights did only in extreme cases. It wasn't part of a nightly routine or any kind of expected discipline. It was a response to danger, plain and simple. If there was a threat of ambush, if battle was expected at dawn, or if the knight was on campaign deep in enemy territory, then yes, he might sleep in at least part of his armor. But even then, it wasn't the full suit from head to toe like the movies suggest. Armor, especially the plate armor developed in the later medieval period, was heavy, restrictive, and required constant maintenance. Wearing it for hours on end was exhausting. Trying to sleep in it could cause all kinds of problems. Metal chafing against the skin, joints stiffening up, even circulation issues if the fit was too tight. Steel conducted cold easily, so lying down on the ground in armor often meant losing body heat rapidly through contact with the earth. Add in the fact that medieval people didn't have modern beds or insulation, and the result is obvious. Sleeping in armor could be downright miserable. Not only was it uncomfortable, it could also be dangerous, especially if the knight fell asleep in a poor position. For example, trying to sleep while wearing a tightly fitted gorget, a steel collar designed to protect the throat, could cause choking or restrict breathing if the head slumped forward during sleep. Because of all that, most knights would avoid sleeping in their armor unless it was absolutely necessary. When, in a secure camp or behind fortified walls, they would remove their gear and rely on sentries, moats, barricades, or early warning systems for protection. Armor was kept close at hand, laid out for quick access, but it wasn't clinging to their bodies every night. So while the myth of the ever-armored knight may be great for dramatic storytelling, it doesn't hold up when faced with the gritty, practical reality of medieval life. Number 2. Combat ready in minutes. One of the key reasons a knight would ever consider sleeping in armor, or at least in parts of it, was pure necessity. It wasn't about bravado or playing the part of a fearless warrior, it was about survival, readiness, and the brutal speed at which danger could erupt in the medieval world. Knights weren't just soldiers, they were often commanders, and if anything went wrong during the night, an ambush, a fire, or a breach, they were expected to be the first ones up and leading the defense. In a situation like that, you didn't have the luxury of time. You couldn't fumble with buckles and laces or wait for your squire to help you gear up. Seconds mattered. Under calm, daytime conditions with no threats nearby, a trained team of squires could get a knight into full plate armor in roughly 8 to 12 minutes. That might not sound like much, but in a chaotic nighttime situation with limited visibility, confusion, and possibly screaming and clashing steel already in the air, even those few minutes could mean the difference between life and death. so many knights adapted by sleeping in partial gear. They weren't necessarily lying in bed completely encased in steel from head to toe, but they kept on what counted. Typically, a knight would sleep in his padded underlayer, known as a gambeson or acketon. Basically, a thick quilted jacket that offered protection on its own, and prevented metal parts from rubbing directly against the skin. Over that, many would keep on their chainmail shirt, known as a hauberk, which was flexible and easier to sleep in than plate. If things felt especially tense, like during a siege or while marching through enemy territory, they might also keep their breastplate on, since the chest was the most vital area to protect in a sudden attack. The heavier, more awkward parts of the armor, like the helmet and gauntlets, were usually kept nearby, laid out for fast access. A knight could reach over, grab his helmet, strap it on, and be moving toward the fight in under a minute. This setup worked as a smart compromise. It avoided the worst discomfort of full metal armor, while still keeping the knight battle-ready at short notice. Think of it like a modern soldier sleeping with boots on and gear within reach during a combat deployment. You're not comfortable, but you're not vulnerable either. That was the logic. It wasn't about showing off toughness, it was calculated risk management. In those moments, the knight wasn't thinking about etiquette or how polished his armor looked. He was thinking, if something happens in the next few seconds, can I move? Can I fight? Can I survive long enough for my men to rally? That mindset drove every decision around nighttime armor use. It wasn't glamorous, it was practical, often uncomfortable, and completely dictated by the conditions of the moment. Number 3. Real cases, from Crusades to Agincourt. The idea of knights sleeping in armor isn't just a myth built on legend. It's grounded in a few key historical moments where the need for survival outweighed everything else, including comfort. These moments, rare but documented, help us understand not just how knights lived, but how war forced them to adapt their routines in extreme situations. When we look at the historical record, we find that sleeping in armor was not a knightly custom, but a reaction to immediate danger. Something that happened when the threat of sudden attack was so real and close that even the discomfort of metal pressing into skin felt like a small price to pay for being able to leap to your feet armed and ready in seconds. One of the earliest and most revealing examples comes from the Seventh Crusade in 1249. Jean de Joinville, a French nobleman and close companion to King Louis IX, chronicled his experiences in Egypt during this campaign. At one point, the Crusaders found themselves surrounded by enemy forces, uncertain of when or how the Ayyubid army might strike. The air was tense, full of whispers and panic. Joinville notes that many knights, especially senior lords, chose to sleep in their armor, or at least kept it on in part, not out of bravado, but because they simply didn't trust the calm of night. A silent raid could erupt at any time, and being caught without armor meant near certain death. Even though their bodies were sore from marching, and the desert heat made steel even more unbearable, they slept in harness. Sometimes just the breastplate and greaves, sometimes more, because they knew that hesitation in battle was fatal. A much more well-known case occurred over a century later, on the night of October 24th, 1415, just before the Battle of Agincourt. Henry V's English army was in a dire state, outnumbered, exhausted from a punishing march across northern France, and trapped by a far larger French force. They had no proper tents, few provisions, and the weather had turned against them. Cold rain had turned the fields into ankle-deep mud. That night, English soldiers, including knights, lay down in soaked fields with no shelter. And yet, they didn't strip out of their gear. Contemporary accounts describe men lying in the mud, fully clothed, which in this case included partial armor. It wasn't about keeping up appearances, it was pure survival instinct. No one knew when the enemy might strike or whether scouts would try a nighttime ambush. Knights, knowing how long it could take to put on a full suit of armor even with the help of squires, made practical compromises. They slept wearing their hauberks, chainmail shirts, gambesons, quilted padding, and often their cuirasses, breastplates, leaving helmets and gauntlets beside them, ready to don in a flash. It wasn't ideal, in fact, it was miserable. Wet armor accelerated rust, chilled the body, and pressed painfully against flesh when lying down. But in that moment, preserving the ability to fight within seconds was worth every sore joint and restless hour. Even English longbowmen who didn't wear full armor didn't sleep in total comfort. Their padded jackets, designed to absorb impacts, stayed on all night. These jackets doubled as warmth and protection. Unlike knights, they didn't have the benefit of squires or even full plate protection, so being prepared to scramble up and shoot within seconds was their main concern. Everyone, from common archer to highborn knight, calculated how much discomfort they could take to stay alive one more night. These real-world cases remind us that sleeping in armor wasn't a display of courage or medieval machismo. It was a cold, calculated decision made under pressure. It happened in crisis, in moments when the line between life and death was razor-thin. That's why the chroniclers remembered it. Not because it was common, but because it was a stark reflection of how brutal and unpredictable medieval warfare truly was. Number 4. The cost of sleeping in steel. Sleeping in armor wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be outright dangerous. People today often imagine a knight simply lying down in his shiny plate like a medieval Iron Man, and waking up ready to swing a sword at sunrise. But the reality? Much more brutal and far less glamorous. Full-plate armor, while marvelously engineered for battle, wasn't designed for rest. The moment a knight tried to lie down in it, a whole set of problems kicked in. Physical, medical, and even logistical. Let's start with temperature. Steel is a conductor, not an insulator. During the day, it could trap heat and bake the wearer inside like an oven, but at night, it had the opposite effect. The metal would draw warmth away from the body, radiating it into the ground or cold night air. A knight sleeping on bare earth or a thin layer of straw could find himself freezing by dawn, with cold seeping into his bones through the very armor meant to protect him. This was especially harsh during campaign seasons in autumn or early spring, where temperatures dropped dramatically after dark. Then there's the pressure issue. Plate armor wasn't soft, even with the best padded gamsons or underclothes beneath it. Lying down in it meant having your weight pressing the armor into your own joints. Elbows, shoulders, hips, knees. Try falling asleep when the edges of your breastplate are cutting into your ribs every time you shift, or when your greaves push into your shins, no matter how you position yourself. Even a few hours of restless sleep like that would leave you stiff, sore, and barely able to move properly the next morning. And if you were expected to fight at dawn, that stiffness could be deadly. Ventilation was another major issue. Armor didn't breathe. Enclosed within layers of steel and cloth, the knight's body had no way to release moisture. Sweat would accumulate fast, soaking through the underlayers and staying trapped. Within a few hours, the buildup of sweat, friction, and lack of airflow would cause irritation. Overnight? That turned into rashes, raw skin, and sometimes full-blown skin infections. In longer campaigns, knights who wore armor continuously for 2 or 3 days straight suffered from swollen limbs, chafed thighs, and painful abrasions that could turn septic. One of the most dangerous parts of sleeping fully armored was the gorget, a stiff metal collar worn to protect the throat. Lying down while wearing one could become a real risk. If the knight's head slumped in the wrong direction or the collar pinched too tightly, it could restrict airflow or press against the windpipe. Sleeping in that position wasn't just uncomfortable, it could turn fatal if no one noticed. It's not hard to see why many knights, even in hostile territory, removed their gorget or helmet before trying to sleep, if they had any choice at all. So, while the idea of sleeping in armor has a certain tough warrior mystique in modern minds, for actual knights it was a physical and medical nightmare. That's why most commanders only allowed it when absolutely necessary. If the camp was secure and well guarded, armor came off. When it didn't, the cost wasn't just a bad night. It could be a weakened, sick, or injured knight before the battle even began. Number 5. How knights built their camps to sleep without armor. Sleeping without armor didn't mean knights were being careless or lazy. It meant they were smart enough to use their environment as their first line of defense. When knights were on campaign, especially over long distances or during sieges, they had to figure out how to stay protected while still getting real rest. You can't fight well if you're exhausted, bruised, or stiff from a night wrapped in steel. That's why setting up a proper camp became a kind of art, mixing military discipline with everyday survival. First came the layout. Camps were never placed randomly. The location was carefully chosen, often on slightly elevated ground, to avoid water collecting during rain, and ideally with natural barriers like rivers or forests that could block or slow enemies. Once the spot was picked, soldiers and squires got to work fast. The outer line of defense usually involved digging a trench around the camp. The dirt from the trench could be built up into a low embankment, and into that embankment, sharpened wooden stakes were driven, angled outward to impale or trip up attackers. This kind of early warning system didn't stop all threats, but it created noise and resistance that could buy time. Within that perimeter, the knights' tents or pavilions were set up. These were far from primitive. A high-ranking knight might have a large round or rectangular tent supported by a central pole, sometimes even with a wooden floor or carpet. Inside, there'd be a folding wooden bed, a thick layer of straw, and heavy blankets or animal skins for warmth. The more luxurious setups had pillows, oil lamps, and wooden chests for personal items. This was a traveling home, not just a shelter, but even in the comfort of these tents, gear was arranged like part of a drill. Armor was never just thrown in a corner. It was placed in a strict order: greaves and sabatons near the foot of the bed, cuirass and pauldrons on a stand, helmet and gauntlets close to hand. This made it possible to dress quickly in the dark or while half awake. The squire, of course, played a huge role here. A knight's squire wasn't just a servant, he was his lifeline. At night, a squire often stayed just outside the tent, sleeping lightly or even standing watch, ready to help his lord suit up at the first shout of alarm. Guards were posted throughout the camp in rotating shifts. These weren't just basic watchmen. Some were experienced soldiers with orders to wake the knights if anything felt off. Patrols moved silently through the camp perimeter, checking for signs of movement or any breach in the trench or barriers. Fires were kept small and controlled to avoid attracting attention, and noise discipline was enforced strictly. Some camps even went a step further. Supply wagons were positioned in defensive circles or squares around the inner area, forming a makeshift barricade. Shields and spears were sometimes laid out in rows, not just for access, but also to act as last resort deterrents. These setups could be torn down quickly in the morning and rebuilt the next evening. It was efficiency born of necessity. All of this made it possible, safe even, for a knight to take off his armor, lay down in his padded clothing or undergarments, and get a few solid hours of rest without constantly fearing for his life. They trusted the system: the trench, the stakes, the patrols, the squire. It was a system built on experience, and when done right, it meant you could fight like a lion by day and sleep like a man by night. Number 6. Why the myth still lives. The reason the image of knights sleeping in full armor still sticks in people's minds comes down to how deeply that idea has been woven into popular culture across generations. It didn't survive because it was common practice in the Middle Ages. It survived because it became part of a symbolic visual language that we still use to define what a knight represents. In reality, the medieval knight was a complex figure shaped by duty, faith, warfare, and practical needs like food, rest, and basic health. But in stories, paintings, and digital media, those details get filtered out. What remains is the shining shell: armor, always ready, never resting. This persistence of the myth is largely a result of how easily it fits into narrative and visual storytelling. A knight in full gear is instantly recognizable, instantly dramatic, and instantly heroic. The image is bold and needs no explanation. When you show a knight lying on the ground in full plate, it immediately suggests readiness, discipline, and bravery. And unlike historical accuracy, which requires nuance and context, These symbols speak in visual shorthand. They're efficient. They work across languages, genres, and mediums, and they demand no effort from the audience to interpret. The modern entertainment industry has reinforced this myth even more powerfully. From the early days of theater and opera to the golden age of cinema and into today's high-budget streaming shows and video games, the armored knight is a centerpiece. But here's the key. Media thrives on compression. Scenes need to move fast. Emotions need to hit hard. Story doesn't slow down to show a knight peeling off his armor before bed or struggling to put it back on at night's alarm. Instead, he's shown already in motion, reacting instantly, because pacing matters more than precision. And every time that shortcut is used, the myth deepens. One more layer gets added to the collective assumption that sleeping in armor must have been standard. Another part of why the myth holds up so well is because it aligns perfectly with modern ideas of heroism. People still admire the notion of being always ready, always alert, always sacrificing comfort for duty. Whether it's a firefighter sleeping in uniform or a soldier in the field, we understand and respect that concept of readiness. The armored knight fits this same archetype. Even if the historical reality was more about routine maintenance and sore shoulders, the ideal of total commitment remains attractive. It's aspirational, and myths that feel emotionally true are often stronger than facts that feel dull or awkward. Even reenactments and historical documentaries sometimes play into this visual expectation. While experts may explain the truth in words, the visuals often show what audiences expect. Shining plate, standing guard, or sleeping like a statue. Because accuracy is subtle, but fantasy is loud. And when you're selling a story, whether in a book, a scene, or a screenshot, the loud image usually wins.